From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. In the second of his two-part analysis of the grain markets this week, K-State's Dan O'Brien will focus on what's going on today in the wheat and soybean markets. The latest on wheat basis levels at Kansas elevators holding up extremely well, and Dan's thoughts on what's underpinning soybean prices and keeping them strong, even as they've retreated somewhat in recent days. Then K-State's Romulo Lollato talking about the extent of freeze injury to Kansas winter wheat from last week's multi-day cold snap. He tells what symptoms of lasting damage you producers could be scouting for over these next several days. And further ahead, on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp joins us right here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. This is the Friday edition of Agriculture Today. Thanks for being along once more. As noted yesterday, we're allocating extra time this week to the grain markets, given the dynamics that we've seen in these trades, to say the very least, in recent trading days and even weeks. Along with us once more, Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension. Dan, when we left you yesterday, we had talked over the corn and grain sorghum markets, but our attention now turns to wheat and soybeans. And let's start with wheat, where we see prices pushing $7 or better on the board amidst what is projected to be a record world wheat crop. Go figure.
Well, as you and I have talked about, I don't doubt that if you assume average weather conditions from here on out in these areas, and that we avoid problems in key production areas, including ourselves, the Black Sea region, and Europe, that you could come to that. But you're betting on the average. You know, in the materials we put together for this week on Ag Manager, you can see what the global moisture maps are. And we're dry in parts of Europe. There are parts of Russia, northern part of Ukraine, pretty dry. In the United States, you look at the drought monitor map, that thing's expanding. But we kind of gotten out of that with some major rains, at least as I was watching that on that map the last several weeks. But now again, it seems the western third of Kansas is getting enveloped in these areas. And when you look to the north of us up into the spring wheat areas, almost all of North Dakota and now South Dakota, parts of Nebraska, all getting caught up in this dry weather thing. There's some, I guess we call hybrid weather forecasting modeling efforts that also show in the short term, there's some pretty dry areas that are developing in the central and eastern corn belt too. Of course, that's great for planting weather. And really, if anything else, you know, all the support we have in these grain markets, we're talking soybeans today, talked again, feed grains yesterday, it has to do with a whole combination of factors all together. China, their demand pull for a number of things. Soybeans, of course, they're feeding some of their own wheat. We talked about feed grains in play. And although it's not directly a wheat issue, the dry weather for the second crop corn down in Brazil affecting us as the world and ourselves start to pull corn demand in and create a vacuum and a need to have a backfill, maybe is a good term for wheat or whatever we can to still get done our livestock feeding and maybe other things too. So anyway, those key factors and our own worries about these dry areas are all at play right now. And I guess doing anything but helping grain traders and not just speculative traders, but commercial users, farmers, etc. There's nobody sleeping easily right now with regard to the grain markets just because of all these levels of international uncertainty on both the demand and the supply side.
Then what are we seeing, Dan, in local wheat basis trends around Kansas? And of course, you track these routinely. obviously strong prices, but what within that are you reading?
Well, it looks like in the western third of the state, for the locations we follow closely around the Colby area and also the Dodge City, Garden City area, wheat basis is holding up very well. And of course, that's where we'd expect, particularly Southwest, the wheat feeding side would come in and be supportive of those markets. A little bit more volatility, just a penny or so weakness in the Salina and Hutchinson areas, not quite as strong an uptrend as out in the West. When you go to the East, Topeka, I'm really looking at the heart of the terminal markets right there, where we're at in terms of those Topeka elevators. Some weakness coming in the last few days with regard to wheat basis. Interesting, again, Columbus, Kansas is a place that in the Kansas grain markets, we haven't been paying enough attention to. Right now, their basis just chugging right along, level, steady, the strongest it's been since then, including 2017, and just going sideways. Interesting to look at that area and see what feed grain prices are doing as well as soybean prices. So interesting. And so that's an area where we're pulling grain, if we can, down to the southeast more readily. We can do it from anywhere, but that's logistically the easiest. So you ask what the basis is doing. Western third of the state, very, very well and steady. Southeast, about the same. Pretty much the same in the central and northeast. Maybe a little bit of weakness emerging by just a few cents in those other areas.
We are 6 to 8 weeks ahead of harvest, depending on where you are in the state, of course. So when thinking about bringing that wheat to town, it seems like the most straightforward marketing approach for a producer, sell right off the truck at the scales. Dan, keep it that simple.
And the question this year is, when the wheat comes off the scale, will it go into the elevator to get ready to be put on a train to head off to an export market, or will there be a livestock feeder possibly bringing that straight in? And the wheat to corn price ratios in parts of the state would indicate that, gosh, that might happen. Again, we've been calculating for as all this has developed the last couple months, wheat versus corn price ratios. And just on the cash side, in the western third of the state, looking at the Colby and Garden City locations, cash wheat to cash corn prices are 92 and 95% in those major markets in the West. If by the time you adjust those per bushel prices, and again, different weights of bushels, again, 56 pounds for corn, 60 for wheat is typically what we go with. If you adjust them down to a per pound basis, you have the price of wheat being 88, 89% that of corn. So if we're tight on getting grain to accomplish what we need to for livestock feeding, then we have a wheat harvest coming up way sooner than we're going to have a corn harvest or a grain sorghum harvest out to the west. I would say in other parts of the state, we haven't been seeing as much of a crunch, but here this week in the Hutchinson area, just taking the top end grain bids there are weaker grain bids for both corn and wheat than we're looking at, but we're just taking the top ones. You got a price ratio in Hutchinson this week on yesterday's closes, 93% with 683 wheat, 735 corn. Wow. And by the time you take that to a per pound basis, you're down to 87%. And that's actually just a tick lower as a ratio than it is even out in Garden City and Colby. So the movement with basis and with grains against grains to accomplish things. And that's what, to me, is so unusual about this particular event, in that we typically don't see wheat price below corn. And we typically don't see again, we're talking about soybeans versus corn for planted acres at times. We have it anyway. You're seeing that the soybean to corn planted ratio, which is typically anymore, it's about 2.4, is about neutral, plus or minus a little bit. So when you look at the current new crop bids for November soybeans versus Dees corn, it's 2.39, dead neutral. But around the state, if you look out to Garden City and Colby, you're at 2.16, 2.27, definitely favoring corn. And most of the rest of the state, you're looking at, say, 2.3, 2.4, 2.45, more neutral. But boy, out to the west, not giving many signals to go with soybeans right now.
Well, now that we've segued into soybeans, we've seen some slippage in that market. It's been a runaway up until recent trading days, at least on the board. Just right to it, Dan, about one's marketing posture here. You talked yesterday about setting profit goals for corn and grain sorghum. Same refrain for soybeans?
Yes. As we talked about, the slippage has occurred by some 20, 30 cents, but any more, that's just what we might call noise in the market. Gosh, we're up and down 20, 30 cents. Yesterday, July closed at 15.02. We're down to $15.
down, right.
Amazing, isn't it?
Right.
But it's really for new crop bids, again, November 13, 18 and 3/4. And we had been spending time at like $11.80, $12. And the new crop bids for soybeans, pulled them up in the locations we're following. They're ranging across the state out to the west about $12.29, $12.34 in the Colby Goodland locations. And then in southeast, Kansas, Columbus, about $12.44. Again, Salina, Hutchinson, Topeka, top bids, $12.64, $12.69. Really, I think the conundrum, Eric, for almost everybody is that nobody's doubting we've got great bids. But they're wondering, first of all, about their production risk on the bottom side. And then on the other side, is this the time to make their move? And I really, along with having a financial management goal in terms of deciding when to act or not, looking at rate of returns rather than trying to hit the top of this market, really to divide up your sales over a period of time. And you're not going to, quote, beat the market, but you don't want to lose to the market. Right. And one way to lose on it is to save up everything and try to have the one big sale that'll do it all. And you might hit it, but you might not. But it just makes sense to diversify the timing of your sales and try to, in a portfolio sense, try to package some of this together.
And in that, we'd once more invite you producers to stay on top of what Dan gathers every week in regard to the market trends and the factors influencing those trends in his notes, which are posted on agmanager.info. Dan, thanks for the big overview this week. And next Friday, we'll talk once more.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension, with us here on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues now. Well, it's been about a week and a half since those freezing temperatures settled in across a fair part of Kansas and caused concern about the winter wheat crop and whether there would be freeze damage. Well, we're going to draw some observations here on what might have happened and what you producers might be watching for in your stands in regard to that damage. Romulo Lollato has joined us from the road, where he's checking K-State wheat plots as we speak. He is a wheat production specialist with K-State Research and Extension. So, Romulo, we should point out, first of all, there can be mitigating factors in the field that can affect that potential for freeze damage, and you might go over those.
Hi, Eric. Yeah, so it seems like every year in Kansas we have one of these events, right, where temperatures dip pretty low sometime, either late March or mid to late April there. And this year was no different, right? The temperatures dropped to pretty cold temperatures for 2 or 3 days in a row there. And that really makes us concerned with the status of the wheat crop. And so a few of the things that we consider whenever we are thinking of the potential for the freeze damage there, of course, one of them is the development of the wheat crop, right? How far along is the crop in its cycle? And the reason we consider that is because the different developmental stages of the crop, they have different sensitivities to temperature. So some of our estimates that we have based on temperature models and also based on field observations, right? We were estimating that whenever that freeze happened last week, the crop was anywhere from about the jointing stage in the majority of western Kansas and northwest Kansas, with a few fields that were late planted probably being behind that, still on that tillering or upright tiller stage. Now, as we moved to central Kansas, it was definitely jointed already, and some of the more advanced crops are reaching to that boot stage already, especially in south central Kansas. And as we look at southeast Kansas, which is typically further along, maybe the majority of the crop was between flag leaf emergence and boot, and some of the crops still starting to head out. So the temperature thresholds that we have on those different stages are about 24 degrees if the crop is jointing, about 28 degrees if the crop is between jointing and the boot stage there, and more close to 30, 32 degrees if the crop is heading. So that's the first thing that we look at whenever we are assessing the potential for freeze damage.
Well, following up then, did the actual temperatures test those thresholds, Romulo?
Yeah, so in terms of, if we look at those 3 days that temperatures were low last week, we had a total of up to about 23 hours of temperatures below 28 degrees, mostly concentrated in the northwest and western part of the state. And we had as many as about 14, 15 hours of temperatures below 24. And these were really restricted to the northwest corner of the state. Whenever we match those cold temperatures with the crop stage of development, we were estimating that probably the greatest risk of the crop would be in southwest Kansas, where the crop was further along, and temperatures got really cold and were sustained in cold below the thresholds for a long period of time. And that moves up to about central Kansas, that Ellsworth counties, where it seems like the crop was even further along, and temperatures were perhaps not as cold, but the crop was further along, so that increases the risk as well. And stretching into the northwest part of the state. So it's really almost like an inverted V shape there, going from the northwest to the central part of the state and then down to southwest. And again, that's because in the northwest, our major concern was not necessarily the crop stage, but really how cold it was and for how long it was cold.
As you said, Romulo, a large proportion of the Kansas crop was at least in the jointing stage. So let's stay with that for just a moment here when we talk about the signs of damage that producers ought to be looking for if they haven't been out already scouting their fields. If wheat had reached that jointing stage, what indicators would be indicative of freeze damage to that wheat?
So if the wheat is jointing, Eric, we suggest growers look for the new leaves, right? Whenever the crop starts throwing out new leaves, if those are yellow, that's probably a sign of concern there. If those are nice and green, then there's typically a pretty good sign that a few tillers might be damaged, but at least there's still potential for growth from that plant. Then, of course, probably the most important thing to look for is how are those little tiny heads looking like, right? At that point in time, during jointing, we can already find the developing head if we get a pocket knife and we split those stems. And so really what we want to see is a light green, nice and firm little head being developed within that stem. If it is more like mushy and brown and just like it's a pretty good sign that it was toasted by the freeze there. And so at least that tiller is gone. Again, the plant might still be okay and it might, if we have moisture, throw out some secondary tillers and even tertiary tillers and still make up for those lost main stems. But again, if those developing heads are more towards that brown and mushy, then that's of concern that tiller has not made it through the cold spell. We can look at the stem integrity as well. If growers were out there during the time of freeze, they could have looked for ice in the stem and the potential for those stems to disrupt, right? That ice to just freeze that stem to the point where it disrupts. At this point now that it has warmed up already, we can look for the integrity of that stem, whether it is entirely turgid and firm or whether there is any broken part of that stem, right? And that can actually cause some lodging. So for the wheat at the jointing stage, that's more or less what we recommend looking for, Eric.
As you said, though, Romulo, there may have been some stands out there as far along as the boot stage in south central and southeast Kansas. Now, if freezing temperatures settled in for a long enough period of time, that damage can be even more pronounced, can't it?
Yeah, so definitely, whenever the crop is at the boot stage, it's going to be more susceptible to those cold temperatures. It can cause some damage to the developing head that is within the boot as well. But probably the most apparent thing that we will see from that crop will be that the heads might not come up through the whorl of that plant, and they might actually have to push through the side of the stem, right? Maybe perhaps because that freeze has actually damage the ability of that plant to kind of open the whorl for the head to come through. So that's the main thing that we look for whenever we had that freeze at the boot stage, is that, well, maybe those heads are not going to make it through the actual whorl, but instead they will come out of the stem of the plant. They can still be productive. They might have a shape that is altered from what we come to expect from a normal developed wheat head. But again, they might still be productive as long as those anthers, they were not damaged.
Thankfully, there was no wheat in Kansas anyway that had reached the flowering stage. If it had, it would have been in peril.
Yes. With the temperatures that we had, wheat at the flowering stage would likely have not made it through those cold temperatures. And so the furthest along crop that we saw at that point last week was about just beginning to head. So there was just the awns that were coming out, beginning to appear from the whorl there. We were not aware of any field in Kansas, at least, that was actually flowering last week. If it was, those are candidates for probably considerable amount of damage, if not totally in the crop.
Right. Well, these symptoms at each of the stages should be evident by now, should they not, Romulo? We're now 7 or 8 days at least past that freeze date. So producers, as they go out to their fields, if there is freeze injury, it should be apparent now.
It should start to be apparent now. We usually say, wait 10 days or about a couple of weeks before you go out and sample. At this point in time, we should be able to start seeing any potential damage from the freeze there. And again, if the grower has a diversity of fields that he can sample to really have a better understanding of what the damage was, try to start with those fields that are laying more in the bottom of the landscape, where probably temperatures were slightly colder, or perhaps with varieties that were earlier in development, and so they would be more sensitive to any potential freeze damage. If you have a range of tillage and no tillage fields, probably I would start sampling those no-till fields where the damage can be greater as well. Again, the reason for that potential for greater damage in the no-till fields is that amount of residue that might not allow heat to radiate up from the soil and help keep the canopy warm. And if there is a range of plant density conditions, some fields that had a very good emergence and is looking thick and nice, and other fields that are pretty thin and plants are more scattered, those are also probably more prone to cold damage. So I would start scouting those fields that have a little bit thinner stand as compared to a thicker field.
All right, then. Well, it wouldn't be springtime in Kansas, Romulo, if there were not some challenge or the other to our winter wheat stands. And we would advise producers to check out a fine publication out of K-State Research and Extension on this very topic, spring freeze injury to Kansas wheat, at the K-State Research and Extension online bookstore. Have a look at that, and here's hoping, Romulo, that the majority of those stands came through last week's freezing temperatures in good shape, and you will be reporting on that from the wheat tour upcoming in a couple of weeks. Looking forward to talking with you then on what you're seeing across the Kansas wheat countryside. Thanks for sharing a few thoughts with us right here.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, and most definitely I'll be happy to keep you updated as we go through the state and on what we're seeing around in the wheat quality tour coming up May 17th.
Always appreciate your input. Romulo Lollato is a wheat production specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today continues after this break.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines in review, courtesy in part of DTN. The EPA now has 60 days to either write a new rule to allow for the safe use of chlorpyrifos or halt all food residue tolerances of the insecticide, which would effectively ban most uses of it. This according to a ruling handed down by a federal court yesterday in an opinion from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit in San Francisco. That court said EPA has had long enough to respond to a 2007 petition by environmental groups to ban the chemical. The EPA response says this court must be a final regulation that either revokes all chlorpyrifos tolerances or modifies chlorpyrifos tolerances and makes the requisite safety findings based on aggregate exposure, including with respect to infants and children, according to the court. In an emailed statement to DTN, EPA said it was reviewing its options. Chlorpyrifos, an insecticide that targets crop insect pests such as aphids, primarily used in soybeans, corn, wheat, cotton, and some orchard crops, although its use has fallen from 13 million pounds per year in the late 1990s down to 5 to 7 million pounds per year around 2010. That's according to the U.S. Geological Survey. Corteva, the registrant and the largest manufacturer of the insecticide, announced in February of last year it was discontinuing its production of its brand of chlorpyrifos, Lorsban, citing a drop in demand. The USDA is considering how to regulate Bayer's developmental 5-way herbicide-tolerant corn trait now, which will ultimately tolerate in-season applications of 2,4-D, dicamba, glufosinate, glyphosate, and quizalofop herbicides. USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service received a petition from Monsanto, which is now a legal entity owned by Bayer, to deregulate the new GM corn trait last spring so the company could use it for hybrid seed production. After reviewing comments from the public, the agency announced its next step this week, that is, the launch of an environmental impact review for the new trait. This new 5-way trait would replace Bayer's development of Extendiflex corn, a 3-way trait that tolerates dicamba, glufosinate, and glyphosate. It was deregulated by the USDA in 2016. The company is still waiting on the EPA to approve its current dicamba herbicides on Extendiflex corn, so it's not yet commercialized. In the interim, Bayer has been working on this new 5-way traded corn and is refocusing much of its research efforts there. Two of the USDA's risk management programs available for livestock and dairy producers will be updated starting in 2022. The USDA's Rod Bain reports.
Some USDA risk management policies regarding livestock and dairy will have updates effective for the 2022 insurance year.
Dairy revenue protection has been one of RMA's most successful livestock products, and it's only in its second year. Livestock gross margins available for cattle, dairy, and swine producers.
Risk Management Agency Acting Administrator Richard Flournoy says updates to dairy revenue protection include relaxed record requirements and ensuring the class pricing option remains available for purchase, while livestock gross margin coverage can be purchased on a weekly instead of monthly basis. And while these updates take effect for next year,
under crop insurance, that means they will be available and producers can avail themselves of that after July 1 of this year. So producers can go ahead and start purchasing these policies with these additional flexibilities after July 1.
More details are available through local crop insurance agents or online at www.rma.usda.gov. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And you're tuned in to Agriculture Today. The advance of wheat genetic traits over time is a remarkable story, which has been captured now in a video series produced by the Wheat Foods Council. Marcia Boswell shares some highlights from that documentary on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Amber waves of grain are an iconic landscape, but that does not mean today's varieties are exactly the same as the wheat fields harvested when Catherine Lee Bates penned the lyrics to America the Beautiful. So what's different about modern wheat varieties? The Wheat Foods Council tackled this question in the second episode in its new series of short videos featuring wheat expert Dr. Brett Carver, now available on YouTube. Wheat has been cultivated for nearly 10,000 years, linked to the ancient grains einkorn and emmer. The lineage of these grains still exists, But centuries of selective wheat breeding established wheat as the cereal crop we know today. In the 20th century, researchers really started to unlock the potential of the wheat genome to benefit farmers and their global consumers. Carver, the wheat genetics chair in agriculture at Oklahoma State University, said we use that century mark because wheat breeding really got its beginning in the United States, including Oklahoma, in the 1920s. Since that time, wheat breeders like Carver have used the genes that already exist in wheat to help select varieties with specific traits that allow the plant to be more resilient and a better producer of grain. For example, agronomist and humanitarian Norman Borlaug bred wheat that was shorter and stronger than other varieties at the time. Known as dwarf wheat, these plants were shorter but stood straight in the fields even during gusty days. Carver said, "We have a plant that today is a little bit shorter than it was 100 years ago, and most importantly, it has stronger straw, so it can withstand the winds that we see in the Great Plains and elsewhere in the country." This work by Borlaug kickstarted the Green Revolution, which led to wheat varieties that focused energy on grain production rather than plant height. Borlaug's wheat was credited with saving more than 1 billion lives and earned him a Nobel Peace Prize. Since that time, wheat researchers have continued Borlaug's legacy by continually seeking out varieties with more naturally occurring disease resistance, drought tolerance, and many other factors that increase productivity. In other words, we're trying to produce more food, more grain than we did 100 years ago, with less land area to do it with. That's the challenge we're going to keep facing as we move forward, as our population grows and our land area for crop production diminishes. So we have to improve productivity. Stay tuned for answers to more consumer questions through the Wheat Foods Council, a leading source of science-based information on wheat and grain foods nutrition. Kansas Wheat is a member, along with grain producers, millers, baking suppliers, life science companies, and cereal manufacturers. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia. Quick item here, K-State Research and Extension will be hosting a crop sprayer equipment update, a virtual Zoom session this coming Wednesday, May the 5th, 6:30 in the evening. To find out more about what looks to be a very fine program, contact the Post Rock Extension District Smith Center office or the Twin Creeks Extension District Norton office. This is Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Capping off this Agriculture Today, it's our regular stint on Kansas agricultural weather and the latest from the Weather Data Library here at K-State. Stopping over once again, climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. Mary, you now have official numbers from last week's cold temperatures, and the extremes, well, it's typical Kansas, isn't it?
It is, and it depends upon whether you're looking at the beginning of the week or the end of the week. And, of course, our end of the week for this is Tuesday, because that is the cutoff point for use in the U.S. Drought Monitor update. But from that standpoint, we went from 15 degrees, which was the lowest temperature recorded at the Cheyenne Mesonet in northwest Kansas on the 21st, to 98 degrees at Webster Dam in Rooks County on the 27th. While the 15 degrees was the coldest in that area, there were plenty of readings at the 16-degree range in all three of our western divisions, so that cold air was pretty well entrenched in the west. And even as you move into the eastern parts of the state, we were still well below freezing. All of the eastern divisions dropped down into the mid to low 20s for the low temperatures. And again, they were all on the first part of the week, the 21st or the 22nd of the month. And the warmth was, again, widespread. 98 was the highest, but we got into the upper 80s. All the western divisions broke the 90-degree mark, and all of them were on the last day of the week. So, again, big range.
Well, we hope our sub-freezing temperatures are behind us for the season, Mary.
Definitely. And now that we've had some pretty desirable temperatures for the winter wheat, it's advanced quite a bit. We've got some that is at the flag leaf stage, others that are booting and heading. And, of course, the wheat is much more vulnerable to the cold temperatures at that stage than it is when it's just beginning to joint.
On the moisture side, a drier than anticipated week, you say?
Yes, statewide we were drier than normal. We averaged 0.11 of an inch, which is about 15% of what we typically would see. And that moisture was heavily slanted to the eastern divisions. All western divisions averaged nothing, as did the north central and central divisions. South central barely broke 10%. They were at 11% of normal, and that was 0.08 of an inch. Even the wettest area of the state, which was the southeast corner, averaged only 0.53 of an inch, which is about half of what they would typically see. Now, these numbers don't include the system that came through on Wednesday into Thursday. That was a little bit more productive, but again, it was spotty. Preliminary numbers show the highest amounts in east central Kansas and also some significant moisture in extreme northwestern Kansas. And in northwest Kansas, where we saw some places that got 0.5 inch or more, we're looking over the line in northeastern Colorado, where some locations saw as much as 2 inches of rain. So, again, a fairly spotty pattern. The other area was in east central Kansas, and our biggest rainfall out of that system was 1.34 inches at Garnett.
How does the drought monitor appear to us this week? Has it intensified?
It has intensified a little bit. We've seen some increase in the abnormally dry conditions along southwest Kansas into south central Kansas. It hasn't crept over into southeastern Kansas yet, but if we continue in the dry pattern, that is going to happen. It's going to be moving a little bit. We anticipate next week, again, if we don't get this moisture that's predicted for the Monday-Tuesday storm, we'll see some broad expansion of that abnormally dry, as well as maybe some intensification of the moderate drought in that southwest corner. We may see some improvement in northwest Kansas. Again, getting 1 inch of rain in that area is quite a bit above what they would typically expect, and they've benefited from a number of smaller systems.
Well, let's talk about that next shot of rainfall. An open weekend for the most part, it sounds, but the tail end of the weekend into next week, a chance of rain and a decent chance, you say.
Right. We're seeing the possibilities in the 60 to 70% range. We'll get a better handle on those as we get closer to the actual event. What's even more promising is the amounts that are forecast, and for that, we're seeing some widespread areas of 1 inch or more across most of the state, and that goes from the northeast to the southwest. The area that might miss out on it is along the Kansas-Oklahoma border, particularly as we move into southeastern Kansas, where they may see somewhere in the neighborhood of 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, which sounds pretty good if you're from western Kansas, but that would be about half of what they would typically expect in that southeastern corner.
Still, we'll be welcome in any form or fashion, and spring-like temperatures are going to take over for quite a while, it sounds.
At this point, it looks like we're going to be in the moderate range. It may be slightly warmer, slightly cooler than average, but we're looking at highs somewhere in the upper 70s to low 80s and lows in the mid-40s, which, again, will be pretty close to what we would typically expect at this time of the year.
And the month of May arrives tomorrow. Has that extended outlook changed any, Mary?
At this point, it hasn't changed yet. What we're looking at is a split of increased chances for wetter than normal across the northeast corner and drier than normal across the southwest, with equal chances in between as those systems try and fight out where they're going to land. As far as temperatures go, it's pretty much expecting warmer than normal across the state. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean an early arrival of 100-degree readings, but if we're at 80 when we normally would be at 70, it's going to be warmer than normal.
Now, again, though, it sounds like we have a quiet and pleasant weekend ahead of us.
It's going to be a very nice weekend. We're looking at abundant sunshine, moderate temperatures, and for our change, fairly light winds. Right. So we'll take it.
You bet. Thanks, Mary. Enjoy your weekend.
You as well. Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. Our time's away, and thanks to you for tuning in. Enjoy your weekend as well. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.